Dear friends in Christ Jesus, today I remember that week ago many of you went to the Berkeley Marina to greet our previous pastor Sarah, and how nice of her to come and remember people she affected so greatly when she was in Berkeley. She gave a lot of encouragement and example how to take care of the homeless, how to feed the poor, and how to actually grow in spiritual life. I'm sure that she affected in a lot of your lives. So we're grateful for the teachers, disciples who went before us, and remember that they remember us. We are so connected in spirit that even people physically not here are still among us. We remember the encouragement we all have been received from various Christians and from our parents and for our teachers and those who teach us the basic Christian message. Today we have a title for this Sunday's Gospel. It's about discipleship. I read a story about a Danish boy who came to the United States 1870, and she was a reporter on the New York Times, different newspapers in New York. So when he went to the Methodist Church, he became Christian, and then he, in the enthusiasm he had in the beginning, he went to the pastor and said, I want to become a pastor. And the old pastor calmed him down and said, no, Jacob, no, we have enough pastors here, but what we really need is a consecrated pens. We need people who write about things around us. And because Mr. Rees, that was his last name, decided that maybe he can use his talents in Christ and effort to help his fellow men as a reporter. So what he did, he started writing a book about the conditions surrounding him. He went to the slums and the poor conditions of the city and wrote and revealed the difficulties what people had living in a congested living quarters, having no showers, having no food, babies dying from diseases, without malnutrition. And he was writing, trying to get the city authorities to pay attention to the habits of drunkenness and carriers of crimes. And he wrote the book so clearly that anybody who read the book knew what the conditions were and that the remedies had to be done in order to save the city and the nation. One of the person who read his book came to his office, wanted to talk to him, to Jacob, and he wasn't in the office. He had read the book, and then he wrote a note to him and said, I have read your book and come to help. And that was a lifelong relationship with Jacob Rees and Theodore Roosevelt. So what happened was that his desire to help work together make New York a better place which to live, come to help is words that can echo here among us and describe our attitude we ought to have when we hear a person who is in trouble and who need assistance, and that we have offered also here in the church our hands to people in need, to change people's lives in this city to the better. So we have also disciples in the Bible who have changed lives at that time when they lived. People rich and poor, well-known, criminals, everybody from different walks of life came to Jesus to look for help. Many of them came empty-handed. Nicodemus came to Jesus in the middle of the night. Centurion came middle of the day. Leper and sinful women in the middle of a crowd to have access. Zacchaeus was appearing in the middle of the tree. Matthew offered a party. All they had in common, they had empty hopes, life destroyed, and they had a hope to have a new, better life, new birth, second chance, fresh start, clean conscience. Jesus honored all of them. They had nothing to offer. They were needing everything. Also, in the Old Testament, we had people like Moses, who was a prince of Egypt and was more humble than anyone else. And he led the Israelites from the bondage of Egypt. Apostle Paul, saved from personal need, had a personal encounter with Jesus, and he became apostle of the Gentiles. And John the Baptist was a blood relative to Jesus, the first evangelist, and he said about himself, I must decrease, you must increase. These are people in the Bible who have been talking about discipleship, wanting to follow Jesus. When we turn today's gospel reading to Luke's gospel, Luke traditionally wanted to speak to marginalized people, to poor, to dislodged people, immigrants, Gentiles, women, children, those who were marginalized in that society. And he is wanting to speak Jesus' message to those who need everything, don't have anything. But this gospel reading is pretty harsh. It's not easy to take, because it is actually talking about the cost of discipleship. Cost to love Jesus, to follow him. I wonder if all those disciples who want to follow Jesus in his time realized what they were asking for. Luke makes it very clear what discipleship cost. It means loyalty. It needs to love Jesus more than your loved ones. Hatred never in Jesus' speech means that we hate anybody. That is against his teaching. It's making it the point clear that love should be more. Love to Jesus should be more than love to anybody else. That's what it means. Love to God more than earthly love to any companion, family members, and also it means carrying a cross. Here's two examples: building a tower and going to war. Both are images about discipleship. We have freedom of choice, either to follow, either to live abundant life with Jesus, or live miserable life with sin in bondage. Also, the war image is also telling that we can start following Jesus, realizing that the cost is too much. We have to back off. So before we start following, it gives us an example to count the cost before even going to the war. War image means that the discipleship is actually fighting a war, because once we enter the territory of Christ, we are entering to a different territory than the worldly and the temptations that surround us. When we are bondage in sin, the sin keeps us in bondage and we don't understand what the freedom is, because we never experienced it. Once we experience the freedom that Christ gives us following him, then we realize what temptations are around us. When we are bondage in sin, we don't even realize that there's sin, because we are in the midst of it. Once we get the freedom in Christ, we realize, oh, what powers were binding us so much that we couldn't love God or Jesus or our neighbors. So then the last verse, which is not part of the gospel reading, is speaking about the quality of discipleship and the encouragement for us to be the salt of the world. Like we know the salt without taste loses its taste, it's not salt anymore. So the disciples' quality following Jesus and our commitment and loyalty to him is like a salt in the world, because everybody sees the light we are carrying, the light of Christ's freedom. Freedom to love Jesus is really the topic of this Sunday. What is freedom in Christ? It is between, like the Deuteronomy said, life and death, between life and death, between freedom in Christ or death in sin. Obedience to God's commandments, life in bondage to sin. The Philemon letter is just a lovely letter in New Testament, and maybe the only personal letter that Paul ever wrote. And that's a lovely thing, because Onesimus actually could have been punished for his departure from his owner. He was a really slave in that society, and when he left Philemon to go out and wanted to be a slave anymore, he met Paul, who was in prison. And Paul in prison, he's telling how Onesimus was born again with him in his prison time. And then Paul is writing this wonderful letter back to Philemon, saying that I really command you to take Onesimus back, but it is up to you really. I don't want to pressure you to do this, but I would urge you to take Onesimus back, not as a slave anymore, but as a brother in Christ. So his life from bondage to sin, being disobedient, was now turned around into freedom in Christ, and he would come to his master back and be a free man, not only from slavery, but became a slave to Christ. Because slave to Christ means that we have freedom to love God from all our hearts and our neighbor as ourselves. Freedom is not freedom that we can do anything we want, but it's a freedom in the boundaries of God's will. That's where the freedom is, that we have freedom to love and understand in our mind where we can love our neighbor. We don't have different commands and orders how to love neighbors. We have a heart of love that naturally loves our neighbor because of the love of God in us. Not our natural love. Sometimes we cannot love our neighbors naturally. That's difficult sometimes. But God can amazingly change our heart and give us love to people who we don't naturally love because of God's love in us. That's the change. So salvation, which is a gift in a way, is calling us to follow Jesus, and that means sacrifices. God's following Jesus is also sacrifices. Freedom to sacrifice some of our lifestyle to God, for instance. Instead of buying something that we really like to buy, let's give it to the church, building the church. We have been talking here a lot of this, what God asks us, because he's giving us everything. What is he asking us to do? I think we missed the point that I did not mention what I think is important in this gospel. We can build our church. If we build our church and community, that's we are giving to God in a very practical way. What we are doing with our hands, that's given to God. And we are doing here like Jacob Rees did in New York. We are revising some of the bad conditions in this city, helping homeless people, giving food pantry every month, helping people, also inviting to a fellowship among us, because fellowship is also a gift. Without a fellowship, we are very lonely and isolated. But growing in the fellowship, in the love of Christ, is our confession also today. We try to build up a fellowship of love among ourselves so that we can spread that love to outside of the walls of this church. Amen.